thank you so much for, well, firstly to Alan and Lisa and Terry and everybody for having me here. In the first place, it's wonderful to meet all of you. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. I feel like usually in these readings, I have to say a little bit about the book, and I joke that even though it's been published for 2 years, I still don't know how to say what it's about. Often I start saying like, oh, it's about land reclamation, it's about people, it's about this village, about these boys. It's just like lots of things, but you guys did it way better than I could have done it. So thank you so much. But in brief, so for those of you who don't know the book, it is set in the 20 years before Singapore gains independence from the British. And it is about all those things, about nation building, the land reclamation project that takes place, which massively reshapes the coast. But it focuses on Abu, who's a little boy that you meet him at the beginning of the book. He's 7 years old and kind of tracks him through his life as all of these massive shifts are happening around him and how that affects him, his community, his family. So I'll just read a little bit from the book and then happy to take any questions after this. Decades later, the kampong would trace it all back to this very hour, the waves draining the light from the slim, hungry moon. Decades later, they would wonder what could have been had the Lees simply turned back, had some sickness come upon the father manning the outboard motor, or some screaming fit befallen the youngest, forcing them to abandon the day's work and steer their small wooden craft home. Decades later, they would wonder if any difference could have been made at all. Or would past still coalesce into present, the uncle dying the way he did, an outcast burned to black and bone in a house some said was never his anyway. The couple still destroyed, not swallowed whole by the waves in accordance with some angry god's decree, as the villagers had always feared, but taken to pieces and sold for parts by the inhabitants themselves. If the little boy, the sweetest, most sensitive boy in the kampong, would nevertheless have become a man who so easily bent the future to his will. Perhaps he would have. Perhaps this had nothing to do with the hour, the boat, the sea, and everything to do with the boy. But these questions could only be asked after the wars had been fought, the nation born, and the sea, once thought of as dependable, eternal, stopped with ton upon ton of sand. These questions would not occur to anyone until the events had fully passed them by, until there was nothing to be done. All were fossils, all was calcified history. For now, though, the year was still 1941. The territory of Singapore still governed by the Ang Mohs as it had been for the past century, and the boy, very little, very afraid, still crouched in the back of his father's fishing boat. Liabun was 7, already a year late, as Hia liked to remind him. Hia, now 9, had taken his first trip on his 6th birthday. But while Hia at 6 had been a boy with plump tanned arms and strong calves like springs that could propel him over the low wooden fence at the perimeter of the kampong, Abun at 7 was still cave-chested, with the scrawny limbs and delicate hands of a girl. Despite as much time spent in the sun as his brother, Abun's skin retained its milky pallor, as fine as the white flesh of an expensive fish steamed to perfection. Hence his nickname, Bawal. At the sound of his brother's voice, Abun sprang away from the boat's side. In the weak moonlight, the sea around them appeared as viscous black oil, roiling gently in the breeze. He shuddered to think what could be waiting beneath its pleated surface. Scared, Bawal. He clambered toward Abun, stepping over the ropes and nets that littered the floor of the small boat. He moved with a careless, threatening ease, like the foot-long monitor lizards that scuttled through the tall grass around the kampong. Hia grabbed Abun's shoulders, turning his torso out toward the sea. Wah, so brave. He pushed his brother suddenly, as if to tip him out of the boat. The sea lurched up toward Abun's face, and he clawed at the side, letting out a small whimper. You know, Hia said, Pa never tell you everything about your first trip out. He never tell you about the night swim, huh? Hia went on to say it was a tradition that every fisherman's son went through on his first trip. That soon, Pa would stop the boat in the middle of the empty sea and tell Abun to get out into the water. All around them pulsed the ocean, and up above, blank and starless, was the unending sky. A cloud scraped the thin moon, the darkness deepened. Abun thought of the fish, bright-eyed creatures with their silver bodies of pure, spasming muscle. For the past year, it had been his terrible job to help sort them, still alive in the nets when his father came home. Horrified by gasping, desperate mouths and manic, shiny eyes, he had run away crying at first, but the jeers of his brother and the stern, clicking tongue of his father eventually reconciled him to the task. Thus, he'd learned to present a blank face, to control his expression, even when he stepped by accident on a slimy, stingless jellyfish on the beach, and the wet, alive matter oozed between his toes. He perfected the containment of his distaste for the unruly water that so dominated life around him, felt in the pit of his belly like a cold glass marble he'd accidentally swallowed. But what Hia was suggesting now, to plunge his small self into the wide black sea, this he could not bear. Don't want, was all he said. Don't want, Hia cried, almost gleefully. You got no choice. You must swim far, far away until you hear us call you back. It's the tradition. You know what is tradition? It was the glue that bound everyone else so naturally, but failed somehow to adhere to Abun. Sweeping his grandmother's weeded grave as cicadas screamed like demons in the bushes, visiting the crowded houses of neighbors during the New Year to have his scrawny frame prodded and commented upon. The assumption that he would, one day, like his father, be a fisherman. Tradition was the stick against which he was constantly measured, against which time and time again he came up short. Tradition means, Pa did it, I did it, no choice, you must also do. Hia grinned, his teeth flashing white in the dark. The arches of Abun's feet tensed up, as they always did when he was nervous. He bit his lip. He would not cry. The boat began to slow. Oh, here we go, Hia said. Ready, Boon? Ready for your long, cold swim in the dark? The engine fell silent, and all Abun could hear was the thrum of the waves. They were louder now, as if crashing onto something. It was so dark. He could almost feel the cold water closing in, the sting of salt in his eyes, the burn at the back of his nose. Movement in the water around him, something invisible and large, or small, it didn't matter. What mattered was that it would touch him, brush him, with his slimy skin where he least expected it, on the sole of a foot, on a cheek, on the back of his neck. There was no way to know. The boat had come to a stop. Abun felt his father stand up from where he was sitting behind them, next to the engine. Any time now, Pa would tell him to get up, stop crying, and get into the water. Abun squeezed his eyes shut. He felt Pa's hand on top of his head. But instead of running his fingers through his hair affectionately, as he often did, Pa simply left it resting there. No one said anything. The boat was rocking gently, and still there was that noise of the crashing waves, louder than they should have been. How can? Pa said. He spoke quietly, as if afraid to disturb the air. Don't know, Hia said. Did we go a different way? Can't be, we always go the same way. Abun opened his eyes. Neither Pa nor Hia were looking at him. Instead, they were staring at something ahead of the boat, some enormous shape. It was an island. There was a shoreline not unlike the one they lived by, rocky in some parts, sandy in others. That was the reason for the sound of the waves. They were in the harbor of this landmass. Unlike the flat shore they lived on, however, this island rose up from the sea, a giant humpbacked monster. Abun had never seen cliffs that high. The tide was drawing them closer now, rocking the boat gently toward the shore. Abun looked at Pa and Hia. Hia's mouth was open, and his thick bottom lip glistened, a dew-soaked slug. His already large nostrils flared, like the gills of a fish gasping on land. Pa's face was the opposite, everything closed, mouth pinched, eyebrows pulled tight. From their faces, Abun knew that something was wrong. They were both very still, as if afraid of looming the waking shape before them. But Abun himself felt no fear, only prickling curiosity, along with a strange soft ache. He wished it were day, so he could see the shape of the land before him. He wanted to know if its haunches were covered with rocks or trees, if seagulls dotted its shores, whether the ground was sand or mud. If cliffs gave way to jungle, if there were trails left by animals or people that one could follow. A faint breeze lifted the little hairs on Abun's arm. There was an odd quality to the air now. It seemed to vibrate, as if the island itself were humming. Thank you. What's the deal with the island? Some people have asked me in class.
So when writing like these historical novels, obviously there's, along with the research that has to go into it, there's things that I would think that you had maybe like researched about, or maybe had like wanted to include in the story that you were not able to. How do you, in your writing process, kind of select things to put in and select things to not, that kind of don't make the cut?
With great difficulty and despair. Thank you for that question. You know, it's funny. I researched for about maybe a year before writing this book, formally, and I would say informally for many years before that. I think just chasing my various interests. But officially, I was researching for about a year. So that involved, looking up books on this time period, going to the National Archives, like talking to historians. I spoke to a geographer who specialized in mangrove swamps in Southeast Asia and kind of ran the like major mangrove swamp lab at the Singapore National University. And I think in that phase, it's very easy to fall down various wormholes, as any of you who write historical fiction or any kind of work that requires research, knows very well. Because the pleasure is in the, the learning about all this stuff, and the reason why you want to write the book is because you're interested in it. And I think the way I think about it is the research is kind of making the clay. Like you have to make the clay before you can throw the pot, the very messy. I once did pottery and it ended very badly, but I think of it as you don't know what you don't know until you actually do the research. And so I think so that has to be a sort of pretty exploratory process. Like you can't, force yourself into any kind of efficiency or, I think in novel writing you can't do that anyway because it's all chaotic, sort of has to be a joyful chaos. But I think in that stage it's hard to know what you're looking for. And so you just have to kind of look at everything. You have to read everything, talk to people that you find interesting, look at photographs, go down wormholes. And then at some point, if you do want to write a novel, then you sort of step back and think, okay, what is the story that you want to tell? And it can feel hugely overwhelming because then you've done all of this work, right? And you have all these notes and, you've done the work, you feel it's a waste to put it aside. But I think then for me, what's really important is approaching the work through the characters. So trying to figure out, I think for this book, I knew that I wanted it to be a young boy who was growing up during this time of change, and I knew where he would end up at the end. So as long as I filtered everything through the characters' stories, then it would help me decide what was relevant and what wasn't. But you'll see, if you read the book, there's some chapters where I can't resist. I say the characters did not know that XYZ was happening. So that was my way of getting in stuff that, wasn't directly related to their lives and they wouldn't have lived through, but that still was relevant for the overall arc of the book and like what was happening outside of it. And that gave the reader a slightly, a bit more context. Which is also why I chose the point of view I did. So the book moves through multiple points of view, but it's also in a very omniscient, kind of godlike narrative voice that can go in and out of characters' consciousnesses. So that allowed me to include other historical stuff, but still, I did have to cut a lot. So also with the help of a good editor who, isn't as attached to the research and can tell you what's working and what's bogging you down.
Awesome, thank you.
Was your home country of Singapore something you always knew you wanted to write about eventually, or was there like a moment for you where you were like, this is a story that I need to tell?
Yeah, I think I'm always writing about Singapore. So I left Singapore when I was 18. I came to the US for college, undergrad like many of you in the audience. And I had no idea I wanted to be a writer at that point. It took me many years before finding fiction. But when I started writing fiction, I found that all my characters were related to Singapore in some way or another. And my first novel is actually, it's speculative fiction. It's set in a world where people are on the cusp of living forever, so it's much more sci-fi. It's like in the future. It's set in New York. The characters aren't Singaporean. But when the book came out, I did an interview for a Singapore newspaper, and the reporter said to me, she said, well, this is it's a society where success is very narrowly defined, and people are being measured by these very restrictive metrics. And I felt that it was very familiar. It felt like just like Singapore. And so even when I think I'm not writing about it, I'm writing about this science sci-fi universe where it's total fantasy and I've made it all up, it somehow always comes back to, where I'm from, which is maybe why we all become writers in some way. There's like some story that we're trying to tell, and we just circle those stories in different ways and different forms. And so I think this book, I approached it much more head on. And, they briefly mentioned in the introduction some things that I said in interviews before, this sense of being an immigrant in time, or, I think much of a lot of the conversations that I would have with older generations, to me, felt like there were parallels with, immigrant stories in the US, where you had people coming over and talking about this before time, and then now you live in the after. And what was strange to me was that was deeply familiar in how I grew up. I felt that I grew up surrounded by those narratives, even in Singapore, even though people had never left, right? And I think it's because the country shifted so much in just 30 years that it was as if everyone had moved to a different place. It was like the place that they lived in today was no longer what they recognized from 30 years ago, to the point where, and I said this in class today, my mom would tell me like, oh, we used to live in this neighborhood, but I don't know exactly where because they changed all the roads. And the coast is different and the trees are different. It's like literally the land shifting beneath your feet. And I think that's a theme that's very common in a lot of Singaporean writers and artists' work, because that's like what we're constantly grappling with. Like, what does, I don't know, like, how do you know who you are or where you came from if everything around you, like the literal physical markers, are just shifting so much? And what does it mean that we can erase so quickly and build? Because that means that things that have happened, even a lot of historical traumas are just sort of buried and never talked about. And so I think that's kind of what my book was trying to get at. Like, why do we have this desire to constantly make things anew, right? I think that comes from somewhere. I mean, I think it comes from pain, but, not to psychoanalyze the entire country of Singapore. But, there are these like big historical things that happen, like colonialism and then World War II, and constantly like being a country that's subject to others and then wanting to kind of own your own destiny. And I think that's kind of the original thing out of which this desire to build and build and build and pave over and build came from. Arguably some parallels to the US as well. But yeah, so I think that was what made me want to write about this part of Singapore. And yeah, it just came out in a historical form.
You said your first work was speculative fiction, and this one was a work of historical fiction, which are two pretty different genres. Do you find yourself gravitating towards one genre in particular, or would you say you kind of find the genre as it like fits the idea that you come up with first?
I think for me, strangely, they feel like they have a lot in common, even though they're so different. And I think the main thing that feels similar to me is the fact that setting and the world have a lot of, they're almost characters in both genres, right? Like that setting is very important in historical fiction, and in science fiction or speculative fiction, you are kind of building the setting and building the world and laying out the parameters of that universe. And I think probably in my writing, what I'm interested in is kind of what possibilities are available for an individual within any one system or any one structure. And I think that's a question that both science fiction and historical fiction ask, that there are certain, historical precedents, or there are certain constraints in the science fictional universe. And like, what does that do to individual agency? Like, what choices can you make? And maybe what is morality under those constraints? How much influence can an individual have over their lives in, kind of oppressive structures? So they feel similar to me.
You mentioned you did a lot of research before writing the novel, formally and informally. What were your biggest challenges in doing research when writing this?
Stopping, probably. I think. I'm still doing research on this. I feel like sometimes stuff comes up, or I'm reading for, research for a new book, and I'm like, oh wow, this would be so good for the Great Reclamation. I'm like, wait, no, I finished that book 3 years ago. I should stop doing that. But I think maybe just holding everything in your head at once, and then because I forget, I don't have a very good memory, so often I'll read something and then I'll forget. And then as I'm writing it, I'm like, wait, what happened during this time? Or what's the exact timeline? Or what would the characters have lived through? And then I have to reread the same thing like 3 or 4 times to be able to actually retain the information. And often when I go back to books I've read before, it feels like I've never read them before. But of course I have, and they inform the idea. So it's kind of an iterative process. It's like I do the research, then I get really excited, and I say, okay, I'm going to write this thing, and I start writing, and then I get stuck because I think, oh, I don't know enough. I need to go away and research, and then I end up reading all the same books again. But I glean new things from the same books, and then I can go back to the draft, and then it gives me enough steam to continue it. This just kind of goes on and on and on for several painful years, painful, enjoyable years.
So there are a lot of writers in here, people that want to be writers, well, they are writers now. But I just wonder if you could talk about being a young person coming to sort of decide you want to be a writer, and what that process was like, and what it looked like, and what it was, just what it was like into writing.
Yeah.
Really articulate question.
Sorry, I can't quite hear you, but did you say what is it like to be a writer as a young person?
I was wondering if you could talk about your process of becoming a writer when you
Okay.
decided the decision to become a writer and how that all happened, and when you started really seriously writing.
Yeah. Well, I came about it in quite a roundabout way. And I teach creative writing at Wesleyan as well. So my students always ask me this, and I'm like, I wish I had a more reassuring answer for you. But basically, I had no clue what I was doing or that I wanted to even write. I studied comparative literature at undergrad, and I came to the US on a scholarship from the Singapore government. So as part of that scholarship, I had to go back and work for them for 6 years. Like, that's why they paid for me to come here. And the terms were that I had to go work for the Singaporean Sovereign Wealth Fund, like basically working in finance. Like, I worked in private equity for 6 years after graduating with a degree in comparative literature. I was supposed to study economics, then I double majored and then ended up like not really actually doing the economics. And then so after I graduated, I was very miserable because I thought, oh, I really want to go do a PhD in English and become an English professor, like, many esteemed people around here. But I have to go and work in finance. And so I went and, I did my thing. I mean, I couldn't have afforded not to because I owed them a lot of money. Or rather, I have to pay it back if I didn't go work for them. And I think I was doing it for a couple of years and just feeling really, kind of trapped and, miserable in a fairly predictable way. And then I started writing fiction on my lunch breaks because as a way to just get close to writing and to books again. And it was actually my husband, who had been my boyfriend in college, who said he thought I should write fiction. This makes me sound very unserious, so sometimes I hesitate to share this story, but we were undergrads and I was like, what am I going to do with my life? I have to go work in finance. And he said to me in our sophomore year dorm, he's like, you should be a writer. And I'm like, that's so ridiculous. Like, people don't become writers. This is so idealistic and, thoroughly Western of view. Like, Asian people don't just go and start writing fiction. And it just wasn't within my worldview that you could do any kind of artistic thing. Like, that was not how I grew up. And it wasn't, I didn't see it anywhere in my life. And that was in, I think, 2000 and, anyway, I'll give away my age, but that was during the Obama administration when he said that. And it was only maybe 7 or 8 years later that I wrote my first short story. So I think the seed was planted early, but I never did anything about it because I thought, it's not something I could do. And if you asked him, as people often do, what made him say that, back then he said that he thought that I just loved stories. That was the thing that I loved the most, and I just loved reading and loved books, so he thought I should do that. But whatever it was, I kind of started while I was at this corporate job, writing things on my lunch break, and slowly just fell into it. I just loved it, and I started waking up at like 5 a.m. to write for an hour before going to work at 6 and all of that. And my first novel I wrote entirely that way. So I actually had these notebooks that I would take from the office stationery cupboard that were very big, and then I would go to this cafe that had a basement so I could hide so my colleagues wouldn't see me, because they would be like, what are you doing here by yourself with a notebook? And I would try to fill 2 full pages longhand in that book every day, which came up to about 400 to 500 words. So if I could do that every day, and then I would write on the weekends as well, I could get to about 5,000 words. And that's how I wrote the entire first draft of my first novel, and it took about a year. So, even though it feels like just a little bit that you do every day, it does kind of add up. And often with a novel, it's like, it just feels so insurmountable, right? You have this like massive thing that you're like, it's impossible. How could I write that many words? But if you just kind of sort of, chip away at it, eventually you do have them. And often I find what's more important than actually using the words is spending the time with the project and just, sort of existing in that world and thinking about the characters and just spending time in the space, even if you don't actually write the words. So I did that, and then I finished my contract and I applied to graduate schools, so I applied to MFA programs. But I also happened to sell my first novel before I went to the graduate program. So it was a bit strange, because then I went to my MFA, but I had this book that came out the first year when I was in my MFA. And then I wrote this book while I was at my MFA. So this was my graduate thesis that I wrote there. And then after my MFA, then I just continued writing. I was very fortunate to get a teaching job, and that's what I've been doing ever since. And now working on this very, very long, very heavy, research-heavy third book that maybe will see the light of day one day.
Could you speak a little bit about your MFA experience for students who sort of might be considering or might want to?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I had a great MFA experience. I know that, it's like your mileage may vary. It's like you hear everyone has different experiences, and also so many programs are so different. Some are really big, they have like 50 people, 100 people. Some are really, really tiny. I went to a very small MFA. It only takes 12 people a year across 4 genres. And so it only takes 4 to 5 fiction writers a year. And then like 3 poets or so, and then 3 playwrights, and then the rest are screenwriters. And it's an interdisciplinary MFA. So you go in for your main genre, but then you have to do a secondary genre. So that's why my degree is in fiction and playwriting. I tried to do screenwriting, and it was too hard. And I think it was good for me because it was a program that just gave you a lot of latitude in writing. So we didn't have a ton of requirements. It was mostly just time to write, and then you would have to take workshops. And it was also a fully funded program. So that means that it's kind of like with PhDs where you get a stipend, your tuition is paid for. That was very important to me because I was quitting my job to go do it. And I was like, I know that, it's very not a practical choice. I didn't have a safety net, so I was like, I only applied to programs that were fully funded, so that I wouldn't have to pay tuition and that I would get a stipend. And there are actually many out there, so definitely seek them out if you're applying to MFAs. And I chose that program over a bigger program because there's some that have like 25 or 30 people, and it just felt like it would be a little bit, your own personality. For me, I felt like I would get too distracted and it would be stressful, like managing the social stuff. So I really loved it. It was like small, intimate, a lot of time just writing. I would say some people would find it isolating because it was so small. You're sort of adrift a little bit. So that's one thing to note with smaller programs. And then you have to think about location as well. So I was in Austin, Texas, during the pandemic, so that was interesting. And then, there are programs that are in cities, others in more rural places. So really thinking about your mental health and like where you will be happy and productive, because you will spend a lot of time alone and just with your own words. So what will nourish you in that way? And then, of course, looking at faculty, who teaches at the program, who do you want to work with, because that kind of tells you a bit about the style and the philosophy, or, the different genres that might be more likely, you might be more likely to be in workshop with in terms of your peers. But yeah, I would say what I say to my students is, to go into an MFA if you want time to write and to focus on your craft, but not to get a degree in the sense of like getting an advanced degree. It's not like a master's in a different field where then you have a job coming out of it. So it's more sort of if you really want to hone your craft and to spend time writing, writing short stories, finishing a novel, something like that, then it can be really, really a good experience, I think. Yes.
While it's not your focus, I was curious if you could speak to if the kind of playwriting side of your MFA has kind of reared its head when you've been like writing some of your novels, and what kind of you've pulled from the playwriting side.
I wish it had. I think my desire to do screenwriting is because, as I told the class I visited earlier, I am eternally struggling with plot and just like figuring out, how to make things happen. Like it's just so difficult. And screenwriters seem to have it down. They have like beat sheets and like outlines and like treatments, and they can come up with all these stories before they even write a single word, which I'm very deeply jealous of. And so I kept attending these screenwriting classes to try and figure out how they do it, and have just accepted over the years that my brain does not work that way, and that's not how I write or think. But playwriting is just kind of in between. It's like externally driven enough, but not so much dependent on like actual outlining, because I guess it's less commercial in a way. You don't have to like pitch it to someone before you write it. And so, but at the same time, there's no interiority. You can't have a character thinking, right? You can't really move through time and go into flashbacks. I guess you can have a whole scene, but you still have to show it. Right? Basically, you're forced to show a lot more, and show visually, and show in terms of action and dialogue, which I think as a fiction writer is in a way my weakness or my disinclination. Like I tend to often want to have characters expound for a long time, for example. And so it was useful to force me to write. It felt like writing with my hands tied, to have to make characters talk to each other and to do stuff. I wish it influenced my fiction writing more, but the reality is probably it doesn't that much. I'm trying to. Yes.
You mentioned that you teach creative writing, and I've had the pleasure to take a creative writing class from Saring, and I'm taking one right now with Professor Staples. What's your biggest, what do you want your students to take away from taking your class in terms of, from a creative writing aspect?
That is a good and deep question, existential. I hope that they take away a sense of possibility and kind of a sense of the expansiveness of fiction and of maybe art in general. That even if you don't go on to be a writer professionally, or even if you don't go on to be an English major, because I do get students from other majors, that you kind of, that you enjoy it, and you have this sense that art is something that you can do, that anyone can do, that you have stories to tell, and that only you can tell them the way that you tell them. So kind of, I guess, a respect in your own voice and vision. That's what I hope my students do. I think one more question. Or two. Oh, there's just one hand. You have time for that.
Well, this is in a different vein, but I guess I'm curious if you noticed differences in how your work is kind of read and received in the US versus in Singapore.
Yeah, we talked about it in the class today, but it's definitely different. I think in Singapore, the default narrative of the Singapore story is one of success, and one that kind of lauds the economic miracle, right? The fact that look how far we've come from third world to first. In one generation we've gone from having no plumbing to being one of the richest countries in the world, and that was always presented to me growing up as something that was unequivocally good, that it was really impressive and something to be grateful for. And so I think that's the dominant narrative in Singapore, with no kind of complication. And so I think this book was maybe one of the first few books to really grapple with that question. And so I think, based on my events in Singapore and talking to Singaporeans, something I was very moved by was people saying that they felt a sense of grief that they had felt their whole lives but never had really the vocabulary to talk about, and they were very glad to have read this and to be able to talk about it to other people, because it named something that they didn't feel they were allowed to say, maybe, or that they didn't really consciously say, or that had been so suppressed in many ways. And so I think there's that added layer of having lived through it in Singapore. In the US, I think it's more people don't know that much about Singapore, or they've seen Crazy Rich Asians, which is the that's the dominant narrative. And so I think people are often surprised that this was actually the case, that Singapore was quite different not very long ago, and that it changed so much in a lifetime.
All right, well, round of applause.